US Senate Republicans unveil the bill they hope will put an end to Obamacare. But for many of their own party members, it doesn't go far enough. An opening offer from the UK Prime Minister on EU citizens living in Britain. But will it settle the 27 countries at a summit in Brussels? And a new bill to fight terrorism. France's new government hopes to signal a change away from 19 months of state of emergency. Good to have you with us. I'm Belle Lupton with a roundup of the day's news from across the globe. And we begin in the US, where Republicans in the Senate have unveiled their highly anticipated bill to overhaul the Affordable Care Act. It's the next phase in the Republican Party's long war against former President Obama's landmark health legislation that was passed back in 2010. But as Claire Rush reports, the new bill isn't guaranteed safe passage into legislation.
It's been 7 years in the making for Republicans. The 142-page bill would eliminate many Obamacare provisions. It would repeal requirements for individuals and large companies to buy health insurance. It would also repeal insurance requirements for coverage of mental health and maternity leave. And there would be deep cuts to Medicaid, the federal health care program for those with low incomes. But the fate of the bill is uncertain. Although Republicans have a slim majority in the Senate of 52 to 48, several GOP senators have opposed it and have called for more negotiations. And with unified Democratic opposition, the bill would fail if just 3 GOP senators voted against it. But the Republican author of the bill has defended it.
He said it would lower costs. Obamacare is a direct attack on the middle class, and American families deserve better than its failing status quo.
In some ways, the Senate bill is more moderate than the health bill passed by House Republicans last month, but Democrats remain staunchly opposed.
It's every bit as bad as the House bill. In some ways, it's even worse. The Senate Republican health care bill is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Only this wolf has even sharper teeth than the House bill.
The bill is expected to reach the Senate floor next week. It could come to a vote after 20 hours of debate.
The UK Prime Minister has made her opening bid on the rights of EU citizens living in Britain. Theresa May was speaking in Brussels, where leaders from the 28 countries are holding a summit after Brexit negotiations kicked off on Monday. The remaining 27 countries have agreed to decide by November where EU agencies currently housed in London will be relocated after Brexit. Our Europe correspondent is Eve Irvine. She told us how Theresa May's offer was received in Brussels.
Well, the 28 EU heads of state coming to Brussels on Thursday wanted to show that the EU was united. They wanted to put an optimistic image of that EU across, and the topics on the table for the first day of discussions appeared to allow them to do such. Security and defence was the first working session, and they walked out with an agreement on both a European defence fund that is putting a common budget together, notably when it comes to research and development in the defence sector, 1.5 billion euros a year, a minimum, they say, really from 2020 onwards. They also agreed to a permanent structured cooperation between EU countries. Now, the exact form of that hasn't been made very clear, but we're hearing from a lot of countries, including Ireland, which is, a passionately neutral country, that they are open to working inclusively in this area. We're expecting in the next 3 or 4 months more development on that, but coming out with progress and moving forward on the security sector. Brexit, of course, was not up for negotiation or discussion at this summit. British Prime Minister Theresa May was simply allowed to make a statement after dinner outlining the UK's position, notably when it came to the EU citizens living in the UK. She said they would all be allowed to stay. They would then be allowed to apply for a settled status in the UK, giving them the same rights as UK citizens. She said it would be automatic if you were in the UK 5 years before Brexit happened, and if you had just moved, you would be allowed to stay for that 5 years in order to apply for the settled status. Now, what she didn't mention was the European Court of Justice. She said that all citizens getting that settled status would have UK citizens' rights, but the EU 27 really want to see the EU citizens maintain the rights they currently have today, which means they would be ruled by the European Court of Justice. On leaving the first day of the summit, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that the opening offer from the UK was a start, but a lot remained to be done.
Our correspondent Eve Irvine in Brussels there. Well, here in France, the government has announced a new bill to fight terrorism, one it hopes will replace the state of emergency that's been in place for 19 months now. The new law comes just 2 days after an attacker drove a car carrying explosives into a police convoy in central Paris. Ellen Gainsford reports.
France has been officially in a state of emergency since the November 2015 Paris attacks. But a new security bill aims to replace this measure, beefing up police powers. The government insists it won't infringe on personal freedoms.
You will see that there are big differences and that each time we've tried to take great care to respect individual liberties, but at the same time allow our services to act.
The government plans to establish cordons around areas judged to be at risk of an attack, such as sporting events, concerts, or national holiday events. They'll be installed and presided over by the local authority. Police will have the power to search bags and vehicles. If the driver doesn't comply, they'll be forced to leave the area. Local authorities would be able to close places of worship. 16 mosques have been shut since the state of emergency was first introduced, after they were found to be spreading radical ideology. The measure will be effective for a maximum of 6 months. Police raids would need authorization from a judge and would only be allowed if an individual presented a threat to security and public order. House arrest would be replaced by surveillance. The local authority would be able to oversee the surveillance of individuals. Those affected can opt to use an electronic bracelet and would have their movement restricted to no smaller area than a town. These measures can be renewed every 3 months. But France's emergency measures have drawn criticism from human rights groups, who say individual liberties are being eroded. After it's been presented to the cabinet, the bill will be debated in Parliament before being put to a vote.
US representatives have been reacting to a strike on Mosul's iconic Al-Nouri mosque. The site was blown up on Wednesday as Iraqi forces advanced on Islamic State group's last Iraqi stronghold. Sanam Chantier reports.
This was one of Islam's most revered sites, the Great Mosque of Al-Nouri in Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. In the late hours of Wednesday, the historic landmark and its famous leaning minaret were blown up. Soon after, local television showed images of smoke billowing into the sky. According to Iraq's military, the Islamic State group was responsible for the attack, a claim echoed by US officials. It's the very venue from which the militant's leader proclaimed a self-styled government nearly 3 years ago.
Last night they blew up the mosque in which Baghdadi declared his caliphate. I think it was a very significant moment here in the last 24 hours.
On Thursday, reactions were pouring in from the Iraqi capital.
We call on the United Nations to shed light on these crimes and to stop the Islamic State group.
The Islamic State group showed their ugliness today, so we urge all Iraqi civil society organisations and human rights groups to register these crimes as acts of terrorism.
For their part, the fighters claim it was a US aircraft that destroyed the complex. Previous reports said the Islamic State group had rigged the mosque with explosives to prevent the advance of Iraqi forces.
Nigerian refugees in Cameroon are being urged to go home after 6 people died in a double suicide attack in northern Cameroon. The refugees are fleeing Boko Haram, but Cameroonian authorities are concerned that extremists may be hiding out in refugee camps. Nicolas Germain reports.
These Nigerian refugees fled their country because of attacks carried out by Boko Haram. They settled here in Kolofata in Cameroon. But the area is also regularly hit by Boko Haram suicide bombers. Cameroon is now asking the refugees to go home.
There are more than 1,000 people here. There are no toilets, no food, and there's a risk of diseases spreading. There are incidents linked to suicide bombers. We don't know who is who. Suicide bombers can easily hide among the refugees.
But some refugees are not too eager to return home just yet.
We fled to Cameroon because they took our fields and animals. We have nothing to eat. That's why we're here.
And the UN Agency for Refugees agrees with this point of view. It especially believes refugees should not return to the town of Bangui. This is what the head of the agency said on Wednesday.
I'm extremely worried that large numbers of Nigerian refugees hosted in Cameroon are again returning to northeast Nigeria into a situation dangerously unprepared to receive them.
Those that did return to the town of Bangui said they did so because of difficult conditions in the refugee camps in Cameroon and because they wanted to go home to harvest crops.
In the UK, at least 7 tower blocks have been found to have flammable external panels similar to the ones believed to have exacerbated a fire last week that killed more than 79 people in West London. Samples from 600 high-rise flats are being tested to determine just how many thousands of people are living in potential death traps. Martin Pollard has more.
A week on, and grieving continues for the victims of Britain's deadliest fire in decades. Meanwhile, the government wants to reassure those living in the country's other 4,000 tower blocks. But test results so far make for uncomfortable reading, notably with regard to their cladding.
The government has arranged to test cladding in all relevant tower blocks. Mr. Speaker, shortly before I came to the chamber, I was informed that a number of these tests have come back as combustible. The relevant local authorities and local fire services have been informed.
Further tests are being carried out on around 600 other high-rise buildings, which all have similar cladding. The leader of the opposition has called for the government to find the funds to put the necessary safety measures in place and protect the poorest sections of the population.
The pattern is consistent. Working class people's voices are ignored, their concerns dismissed by those in power. The Grenfell Tower residents and North Kensington community deserve answers, and thousands of people living in tower blocks around the country need very urgent reassurance.
The government has also promised all former Grenfell Tower residents that they will be provided with a new place to live, but it's still unknown how many will be housed in the Kensington borough. Meanwhile, donations are still pouring in from the public, and a charity single has been released to raise money for those affected.
That could have been my nephew. That could have been me up there.
Well, that fire has heaped pressure on the Prime Minister, who's already fighting for political survival after her Conservative Party lost its parliamentary majority in a snap election. Earlier, Theresa May made a statement in Parliament apologising for what she called the failure of the state in the immediate aftermath of that fire.
Mr. Speaker, it should never have happened. In a few moments, I'll say how we're going to discover why it did. But as I said yesterday, that initial failure was then compounded by the fact that the support on the ground in the initial hours was not good enough. As Prime Minister, I have apologised for that second failure and taken responsibility for doing what we can to put it right.
And finally, with International Olympics Day starting here in Paris, the city has been turned into a giant Olympic park. And Paris has really pulled out all the stops. Take a look at this athletics track floating down the River Seine. And that's not it. There's also a diving board off one of the bridges over the river, and the iconic Place de la Concorde has been turned into a giant velodrome. It's all part of Paris's bid to host the 2024 Olympics. The city is fighting it out with Los Angeles, and they'll both find out in September who's won that bid. Temperatures almost as high in Paris as they are in LA, but perhaps not quite. Well, that's all we've got time for this edition. I'll be back in 15 minutes with the latest. Do join me then.